Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How are you on the West Coast today?
Quite well. Spring has finally showed up, and actually summer is not far behind. It's been hot, it's been sunny. We're in California, and the pollen is blasting.
Yeah, it's been the same here. We've had the craziest weather here in the DC area, where it's been, hot for a day or two, and today I think it's a high of 65 and rain for the next couple of days. So it's been up and down, and everybody says, wait, isn't this April? No, it's May. Wait, what time of year? So it's been a little on the crazier side, and someone who is in my backyard is our guest today. I'm going to let Nora do the official introduction. And yeah, so we're very excited about this guest. Very, very excited.
One of the topics that you all have been asking for is scoliosis. And it's always an interesting topic for any movement professional, especially in the Pilates world. And with us today is Karena Thek from Scolio-Pilates. We are so happy to have her. She's actually in the Virginia area, so she's right near Brian, which is awesome. Yep. And she's going to be giving us a basic introduction to scoliosis and talking a bit also about her training program and how you can work in more detail, I would say, with clients with scoliosis, if that's a preference and a passion for you. So welcome, Karena.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you, Brian. I'm just really honored to be here.
It's our pleasure. We are the ones who are honored, because I've been looking forward to this a lot, because when it comes to scoliosis, as Nora and I have talked about, we've worked with it so many times, but we've worked in a very narrow band. And to talk to someone who really understands the ins and outs and goes a lot deeper than we do, I am really looking forward to learning a lot. And like I said to you before at the beginning, it's like, look, now when I have people that come to me that are beyond my scope, it's like, hey, I know the perfect person for you. So this is actually good that we've made this connection, but I can't wait to find out more information. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the topic itself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I guess the most pertinent information, outside of the fact that most of the time you're going to find me looking a lot grubbier because I'm usually outside, but when I'm not teaching. But the whole scoliosis thing came about because I couldn't walk anymore. And so I kind of hobbled in. Well, it wasn't even a hobble. It was more of a crawl into an orthopedic surgeon's office and said, hey, what's going on back here? And he said, well, someday you're going to need surgery. And I said, well, how do you know? He said, well, you'll know. And so that kind of healed. And then I went back 5 years later and I really couldn't walk. I mean, I was it was bad. And so he said, oh, by the way, you have scoliosis. And at that time, I'd been dancing for a long time. I'd been teaching Pilates, and I was like, oh, come on, doesn't everybody have scoliosis? And I'm pretty sure he kind of looked at me over his glasses, and then I'm pretty sure he wrote in his chart, grumpy. Because I was really grumpy. And he said, well, you need surgery. And I said, well, but how do you know? He said, well, because you can't walk, number one. Number two, if you don't have surgery, this is going to be permanent. And I was like, well, what do you mean permanent? Like, how long can I wait? And he said, well, you could probably wait a max of 6 weeks before it's like you permanently don't get back use of that right leg. And so I scheduled the surgery for 5 weeks and 6 days later.
Wow.
Thinking that certainly my leg will come back. But no, it didn't. And so after the surgery, I did in fact get back the use of, or quite a bit of use of, my right leg again. But the pain in my back got so much worse that now I'm teaching as I was before the surgery, lying on the floor of my Pilates studio, and my people were moving on the Cadillac and on the reformer in the chair, and I was directing from my very comfortable spot, not very comfortable spot actually, on the floor of my studio. So this went on for a very long time. This went on for about 18 months. And I decided that this has got to stop. And I pulled out Joe Pilates' book, and I'm just going to do the mat work. I'm just going to start from the beginning, and I'm tired of being on the floor and doing nothing. And so I actually started working through some of that very classical work, and well, by golly, if it didn't help. I would say that about 20% of my pain was eliminated. Still teaching, lying on the floor, still having a very hard time getting from the studio to the car home. It was quite a time. And so I'm getting along, 20% less pain, so I'm doing better. And a mom walks into the studio one day and hands me a book on scoliosis specific exercise. And she said, "Can you teach this to my son?" And I said, "I have no idea what this is." And she said, "Well, it's this woman. She's passed away now. She's in Germany." And I said, "Well, sure, I'll take a look." And of course, it's the Schroet manual. That
right.
Familiar, yes, it's the Bible of scoliosis. And so I thought, well, yeah, I'll go home and read it, and I'll teach it to myself and teach it to your son. And about 3 weeks later, he wasn't in any pain anymore. I wasn't in any pain anymore. He went back to his varsity baseball. I was standing and teaching and waking up without pain. It was like
a miracle.
Wow. It was like a miracle.
I mean, that's
and of
remarkable.
Course I was like, well, it was time for the pain to go away. I'm sure that book was only,
coincidence.
What's a coincidence? And so, of course, I stopped doing the exercise. The pain returned, and I thought, well, maybe I should try it again. And so I did, and the pain went away. And so I stopped doing the exercises again.
As we do.
This sounds familiar.
As we do.
Exactly. As one does. And so it finally dawned on me that, okay, I'm reorganizing things in a way that I'm not able to reorganize with just the straight up Pilates work.
Yeah.
And so I basically hung a banner on my door. I put an ad in the local ad mag and said, "Hey, if you have scoliosis, come work with me. It's free." And I did that for close to 2 years because I didn't know what I was doing. And what a great gift to have somebody walk in and they're willing to offer their body, and there's no pressure because you haven't charged.
Right. You're just like, let's figure this out. Awesome.
Yeah. And so I had a lot of really amazing volunteers that this work stands on their shoulders for sure. And of course, we did start with a lot of information from Karena Thek, but from there it's expanded to, of course, Joseph Pilates. They were contemporaries, and their work overlaps in so many ways. It's like they had conversations, on a regular basis. But there's others also that have overlapped, and we keep trying to grow the work. And I'm sure there'll be more overlap with other schools. I would say now there's probably overlap with 4 or 5 schools of thought, but hopefully in the future, it'll be more like 10 or 12. Yeah. So that's my very long story.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's amazing. So in your case, there was a back problem, and like they said you had scoliosis, and this is not uncommon, right? You hadn't been diagnosed with it before then?
It's interesting, Nora. My parents, well, I grew up in a really small town of like 3 people and 60,000 chickens. Okay. And so going to the doctor there wasn't the easiest thing. And I grew up in Delaware. And so in this area, the big hospital that everyone will travel miles and miles to go to is Johns Hopkins. And so every now and then they would send their residents over to our town so that we would have those doctor services. And I remember doing those roll down tests that are so famous, and walking on my toes and having to strip down to my underwear and have my back looked at. And And I suspect that there's been scoliosis all along. I suspect that maybe it wasn't severe enough at that time for a resident doctor who's been trained in everything and maybe not specifically orthopedics to pick up on. That's my guess.
Right. Wow.
But there was back pain from a very young age. Yeah, for sure.
Why don't we jump into what scoliosis is? Just so there's a lot of people who are new trainers, Pilates instructors, who may hear of it, think they understand it, but possibly don't understand it to the level that you do. So I thought having a definition from someone who really has the ins and outs and nuts and bolts would be a great way to sort of start this off. So, you know, what is your definition?
Yeah, so I like I said earlier, I thought the definition of scoliosis was basically any asymmetry that you could see in the thorax, you know, the spine area, shoulders to butt. And that's just not the case. So scoliosis is defined by the Scoliosis Research Society as 10 degrees of side bend or more. So what does that mean? Well, it means a mermaid that's not a very big mermaid.
Right.
You know, it's a tiny little side bend of the spine, but it also must include rotation of the spine. And so that rotation shows up looking like one side of the back is closer to the wall behind you than the other. It's not that the shoulders and the hips and everybody's turned, because of course we're all capable of doing that, but just one side is turned. And then the last component that makes it scoliosis is that there is a torsional deformity. So think of taking a washcloth and folding it into a square, and you have that washcloth on your hand. And of course you can turn your hand as if you're floating that washcloth on a table, you know, just right and left. That's rotation. But if you take that washcloth and you wring it out, that's torsion. And so you have these vertebral bodies that are no longer just rotating. It's not like, hey, we'd like to look that way. No, there's actually a torque. There's a torsional force within each vertebra, and some will have more than the others. And that's why it makes it so difficult to work with. You're no longer working with a vertebral body that's shaped like the one that's in the textbook. Of course, I'm not sure if anybody has that one, but, but there are some people that are closer to that, certainly, than people with scoliosis. Yeah.
So, one other thing that we wanted to bring up was just that people talk about structural scoliosis, which is what you're talking about, and then also more functional scoliosis. So the body takes a shape that is asymmetrical, but that isn't reflected in the bones. It's really reflected in the soft tissue and in whatever their habits are.
So here's a great example. And sometimes I use extreme examples to help demonstrate because it's just easier to understand. I was working with a child at Dayton Children's Hospital, and she had a leg length discrepancy, and her leg length discrepancy was severe because she'd been in a severe motor vehicle accident when she was 8 years old. And with that motor vehicle accident, the growth plates, I believe it was her left leg, we'll say it's her left leg. A lot of those growth plates from the hip down were shattered. And so the left leg wasn't growing. And so when I met her, her right leg was 12 years old and her left leg was maybe 9. I mean, it was still growing, but there was a big difference in these legs. And then of course the whole innominate. So one half of the pelvis was still younger by a good 3 years than her right one, much, much smaller. And so when I met her, she was standing next to her mom. And as you can imagine, with someone with a severe leg length discrepancy, and especially a child, her shoulders were quite dipped. So let's say the left shoulder was much, much lower than the right. And then she exhibited in standing all the signs of scoliosis: the rotation, the head tip, the head turn, the this, the that, the all of it. And then when she sat down on the exam table, she put her hands next to her hips because I asked her to. And I said, okay, now just straighten your arms as much as you can and wiggle, wiggle, wiggle your butt. Everything is gone. everything. And then when she elongates in that position and then she bent her head forward like she was going to do like a roll down from seated, everything is gone. And so someone who is structural, you can't shake the scoliosis loose. You're going to bend over, and just the act of bending over is enough elongation, enough stretch, enough traction to pull the spine to straight. And that's structural. If it pulls itself to straight with just the tiniest bit of elongation and stretch, that's functional. That's valuable.
Got it.
And if it doesn't, then it's very, very likely it's structural.
That's a great description, because a lot of people, I find that, especially with clients I've had for a long time, sometimes they'll come in and you can see on their face, it's like they've been diagnosed with something and they say, my doctor just told me I've got scoliosis.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, since last night? Really? You woke up with it? Okay, it's a head cold. Scoliosis is the new head cold. I got it. But the person was totally active and all of these sort of things. So it's like, okay, you may have a little bit of a curvature, but could that be more caused by environmental, how you've been sitting at your desk? You know, how many of us, I've got a lot of therapists, I'm sure you do too, the DC area has a lot, that sit cross a leg and write so their body is turned to the left for hours a day, writing on their opposite knee. And then when they stand up, they're amazed that they have a natural turn toward that side. And you've been doing it for 20 years. Hey, guess what? That's going to become a little permanent. So the doctor may be seeing some of that, but it's not limiting their function. It's not limiting what they can do. It's just some soft tissue issues that need to be addressed and hopefully reverse some out of. But do you see people like that, or are you seeing primarily the person who is more structurally based?
These days, I'm seeing mostly structural. But something that you said, Brian, kind of made me think of something. And so I'm going to riff on it just a little bit.
Please.
And that is, you said, well, it's the therapist who's been doing this for 20 years. And you know, they say that meaning Scoliosis Research Society, that 2 to 3% of the population has scoliosis. Although there's some extremely interesting stats out there that show that almost 40% of women over 40 have a lumbar rotation, which with a side bend, of course, that is translated to scoliosis. And then like 60% of women over the age of like 65 have scoliosis. And with an onset for women like in their 40s, and then when they're looking again in the 60s, most of those scoliosis, what that scoliosis specifically looks like is a change that's happened at L5S1. The hip goes one way, the lumbar goes the other. They both rotate in opposite directions. And it's just over and over and over again, we're seeing this. So it's interesting that, yes, maybe that scoliosis that we're seeing, it's called de novo in adult life, maybe that scoliosis is brought on by a lifetime of habits or something functional that turns structural. It's a big, giant question.
Oh, that's very cool, because I've been hearing about things that are kind of between functional and structural, and this explains that. Because somebody's mentioned that to me today. I said, well, what do you mean? Like, how does that work? But that makes perfect sense. So that rotation is in the bones, and it's relatively embedded in the bones. It's not like they can easily move and rotate in both directions. Right. They've got kind of a bias in one direction. Cool.
Right. And you could consider that you might have both in the same body. So if we're saying that functional is a scoliosis that stretches away, then certainly you might see a scoliosis in the lumbar spine that absolutely doesn't stretch away, especially for these de novo or older, age. I can't really call it old age at 40, scoliosis, but it's certainly not diagnosed at the age of 12. So maybe that 40-year-old scoliosis is structural in the lumbar through the sacrum, but maybe the thoracic is completely functional into the cervical. So that's possible to see both in the same body for sure.
Interesting. Are you seeing any correlation? Because you said female, you said above 40. Are there any correlations with anything from estrogen changes, you know, hormonal changes, or any of that sort of thing? Is that anything that it could be that's been looked at versus, you know, osteoporosis, you know, size of their bodies? I mean, there's a lot of different, you know, avenues to sort of look at that. And I'm just curious if that's been looked at.
There's so many things that need to be looked at. And unfortunately, the scoliosis the research money for scoliosis, if it doesn't include surgery, is kind of like the research funding for broccoli. You know, so it's like,
got it.
Yeah. So we know it's good for you, but more studies need to be done, so many studies. But what I can do is I can answer your question partly. And we do know that for an absolute certainty, osteoporosis and scoliosis are definite buddies. If you have an osteoporosis fracture, it could absolutely destabilize the spine and lead to scoliosis. The other part of that is that if you've had scoliosis since you were a child, or have had back pain since you were a child, like I have, then perhaps you chose activities during your lifetime that were less physical, maybe more cerebral. And so therefore you're you haven't built up that bone bank per se. Or maybe you had a medication that you had to take for migraines or for an
autoimmune stuff.
Yeah, all of those medications might also lower your bone density, even if your bank account had been quite amazing. So yes, there's so many factors to look at. And the estrogen thing, I mean, menopause, I mean, I'm having a hard time coming up with the pro. You know, there's all these cons with menopause, and I'm like, where's the pro? Where's the pro? I'm sure there's a silver lining out there.
Still looking for it myself, but maybe there is.
Ongoing research.
Yeah. Oh, that is so interesting. So you started with the Schrott method. That was kind of where you started. And now, and I've worked with a lot of people that have Schrott as kind of their root. And oftentimes it is the root for people with scoliosis. Where do you feel like you have expanded from that, and kind of how did that create a foundation for you? What pieces of that were the foundation for you? And then where have you gone with that?
That's a great question. So when that mom handed me the book, I had a Pilates studio. So it wasn't like I didn't want to use the wall bars that were pictured in the book. I simply didn't have them. Right. And it wasn't like I didn't want to use some of the other equipment that might have been pictured in the book. I didn't have them. I had a Pilates studio. And so immediately the exercises were put onto the Pilates equipment. And the Pilates equipment was a beautiful assistive tool for what I was seeing in the book, and then feeling, you know, the derotations and the coronal plane changes and things like that you see in that stroke manual. It's like, well, okay, how do I make that happen? And how do I use the Pilates equipment? And oh my gosh, is the Pilates equipment perfect for this? And of course, now I have the core line, which is very similar to, you know, the wall bars with the added assistance. And also you could look at it as a challenge of the gliding carts.
Yeah.
And so from there, it was like, it was just one layer at a time came around naturally. Like I remember teaching this one little girl a breathing exercise, and I turned around to her mom to say, hey, wasn't that amazing? Your daughter is amazing. And mom was like green. And I was like, oh, mom, what's going on here? And she said, oh, I was doing the breathing exercise with my daughter. And I said, yeah. And she goes, I don't feel good. And so it was that day that I was like, I need to know so much more about breathing than I know now. And so I looked into the Bradcliffe work out of New Zealand, and they are fabulous. And then from there, it was, of course, you know, if you're in the Pilates community, you really can't avoid being surrounded by all of the latest information that there is on connective tissue. And so, of course, there's that layer. And then there's the dissections. And both times I did a dissection with Gil Headley, I was I just happen to have quite a severe scoliosis model each time. And so it was such a incredible, it was such an incredible learning experience. And so there's all the connective tissue science. And then on top of that, there's the pain science. When you have so many people in so much pain, you need to learn more. And so that's out of the Neuro Orthopedic Institute in Australia. That's David Butler and Laura Mosley, and Explain Pain Supercharged, all of those courses. So the layers are certainly continuing, and the studies that come across my desk, I'm fortunate enough that people will just send me the studies. Sometimes I'll go searching, but sometimes they just send them. So I would say that is our very, very strong base. And then we're continuing to branch from there. But yeah, the Pilates equipment, Nora, it sounds like you've looked at the Schroep manual, and you'll see a lot of very static, you know, find your position and breathe there. And what we've, again, from the beginning, because I didn't think we really had an option, but I think it's also my background is movement. And so how do you find the position and how do you get it moving? And the Pilates equipment allows for that. And it's a real freedom. And it's what we get the most positive feedback on from people who have studied other scoliosis specific exercise methods, that they love the freedom that they can move. And we love that too.
So if I can dive a little deeper there, it sounds like, I mean, Schrott, I know, does a lot of positioning for derotation and using breath and using positioning. And then it sounds like from that basis, in some ways, like from those principles or from those concepts, you then put those into the dynamic environment of the Pilates studio. You can have a spring going this way and a spring going that way. And you can then move within, like from rotation to derotation. And you can kind of, I mean, the joy for that for me is then you're training the body of how to do it itself.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
Not just holding it, but actually training, like how do the muscles actually need to work to get this different posture going? Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing that I'm learning is that, so at the very beginning, it was like, okay, find the position and you're going to hold your spine there, but we'll move an arm or we'll move your legs.
Right.
And now in the past few years or so, what it's been, we call it the Scolio-Pilates wiggle, is that let's kind of, you know, your corrections, you know, the right hip has to go back, you know, the hips have to glide this way and blah, 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 blah. But can you wiggle yourself into that position, move, shake it all out, and wiggle yourself back into that position so that your body's kind of finding that freedom of movement within its current capacity, which might change at any moment.
Yes.
But it's not necessary to find, you know, the apex now and hold it.
Right. Right.
You can move with it. Yeah.
It's like where am I today? Okay. I know kind of where I need to go. And today my hip's moving, and tomorrow, my hip really isn't doing its part of the job for whatever reason, but I can look at the rest of it to kind of move into that position.
Yeah, it's really well said, Nora, because I think there needs to be an enormous amount of respect for where the body is on any given day. Yeah. And I have to, it's easy for me to tell my clients that, hey, I know that your body's a little ticked off today, or maybe chatty is usually the word I use. Your body's a little chatty today, but it doesn't mean you're like sliding downhill. It's a temporary thing. And as soon as whatever it's working through heals, then you'll be right back where you were. And it just takes that little bit of respect to not force things. Yeah. That's
awesome. Nice. I want to remind people who we're talking to, Karena Thek is joining us today. I have learned so much. The last 30 minutes have flown by like nobody's business, and I am just eating all this up. So I wanted to reintroduce you in case anyone's forgotten. You are the creator of Scolio-Pilates. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Where can people find Scolio-Pilates, and you know, if they want to learn more information? I mean, we have a lot more to go over. Before we go any further, I thought I want people to be able to look you up and be able to get more information.
So it's scoliopilates.com. And you can also find us on Instagram. It's Scolio_Pilates. And on YouTube, we do have a YouTube presence, but we haven't kept up with it. You can find lots of new ideas and exercises on Instagram, but the nuts and bolts of who we are is definitely the website. Yeah.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And our social media is Moving Combos on Instagram. If you want to get in touch with us, suggest anything. And this is where you came in, is we got someone said, please, 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 you know, they emailed us, please cover scoliosis. And Nora and I were both like, well, let's find someone. Yeah. So movingcombos@gmail.com is how they got in touch with us, and how, you know, we brought you here is because we like dip our toe into it. You have dove fully into it. So yeah. So like I say, I just wanted to get that out there immediately so we don't, you know, bypass it by the end of the show, because we've gotten pretty deep already and I want to keep going with this. So you say you have a teacher training course as well that you...
We do. And it's really designed to do what Pilates instructors do so well already. Pilates instructors are trained from the very beginning to look at the whole body. So you could say holistically, and they are not going to ever poo-poo the idea that the right ear is connected to the left toe. So, and that is really puts Pilates instructors in a really good place coming into this work, because they'll start drawing those connections sooner than someone else who you might have to train that kind of thought process into, which is fantastic. We do actually love both, but it does put Pilates instructors at an advantage. So the teacher training program is 3 modules. And after the second module, we ask for a case study, which is the application to module 3. And the case study is simply 10 visits with a scoliosis client, and it's a very thorough description of those 10 visits. And the case study is not like, well, you know, if your client doesn't improve, like if pain level 9 doesn't go down to 0, then you fail and you can't enter. It's not like that. It's really just a way for us to know where your thought process is and where we're going to be able to step in and help you once it comes to module 3. And then module 3, we work together intensely, you know, basically as if it were me and you just working together on our own to cover this information, and how do you understand it and how can I help you to the next level. And then there's a small amount of follow-on work after, and then you're part of the community, and we meet quarterly and we try to stay in touch with each other via a community board and questions and pictures and the whole thing. Yeah, it's been really good.
And I want to say, because I've got your website up on my other screen, and it's also, you know, if you're out there and you're listening and you have scoliosis, or you have a client with scoliosis, there's a whole list of practitioners, you know, all over the country that have taken your program, and that you may have access to in your local community. So I just want to put that out there too, because scoliosis, not to put too fine a point on it, but the regular way scoliosis is typically dealt with is not always terribly helpful. You know, and one thing I hear from all of the Pilates teachers I know that specialize in this is they are such an invaluable resource in their community, because orthopedic surgeons don't always do very much at all unless it's surgery oriented. Some physical therapists have a specialty in it, but not all of them. So, you know, you really fulfill a very important niche within the physical medicine community in helping clients with scoliosis.
Yeah, that's definitely correct. As soon as people find out that you're there, and sometimes all that takes is a blog post, you know, scoliosis care in the smallest town in Delaware. That's where I'm from. Yeah. And so they'll start to find you. There's a real dearth of information still. It's like when I first started, it was hard to find the information. Now, if you start searching, find the information, but you won't necessarily find a practitioner in your town. So the practitioners are what we really, really need right now, are people who carry that information, that wealth of information, to start seeing those asymmetries, and of course knowing what to do with those asymmetries, because it can be overwhelming if you don't know. You can see it, but you're like, mm-hmm.
It's complicated. So, you know, to talk a little bit about that, like understanding scoliosis and understanding your client who has scoliosis, or yourself if you've got scoliosis, that's a process. And I think one of the invaluable things a good practitioner can do is just help you understand what's happening in your own body. And it sounds like you went through a little bit of that in terms of your initial process and your initial getting into the scoliosis.
Oh my gosh, it just took me, yeah, it was like Post-it notes, little odds and ends of papers everywhere. I mean, it was just like I would find those papers stuffed everywhere, just trying to figure it out, just trying to sleuth through it. And yeah, and then finally writing the book, putting that together. I really tried to write it to be like the idiot's guide to scoliosis. So like, hey, if you recognize this, do that. But yeah, it's still complex. It's still complex. It's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah.
But it's complex.
In anything that we do that involves movement, there can't be an idiot's guide to it because there's so much that goes on with it. Like you said, the left ear connects to the right big toe. Things do connect to one another. What I'm finding fascinating is how you took, you know, pieces of different methods, you know, because, you know, necessity is the mother of skill. You wanted to learn for yourself. You wanted this information, but it sounded like you weren't just satisfied with one method that involved being very static. You're a mover, just like Nora and I are movers. And most people who listen to this are movers. And we focus on so much on movement that you've taken it and sort of branched that out and helped create, you know, the movement of, you know, movement for scoliosis, which I find fascinating.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I think the movement is definitely going to be the key for scoliosis care moving forward. If you look at scoliosis as a science, yes, it's easy to break it down and say, we need to do these 3 corrections in the pelvis, these 2 corrections in the lumbar, these 3 corrections. And you could break it down that way. But how do you do what the body already knows how to do? And that's really been at the crux of my thought process from the very beginning. And what I mean by that is, you know, you can go to SeaWorld or some other show where they have dolphins and whales doing these tricks, and you can see dolphins jumping through hoops and doing these great backflips and dancing on their tails. And one day I was sitting on the beach and I look out at the ocean and there's a humongous pod of dolphins. There must have been 200 of them. Wow. And I'd say maybe 20 of them at a time were doing all the tricks that you see in SeaWorld, dancing on their tails, going backwards, backflips, double flips. Yeah. I mean, whatever, everything. And I'm like, oh, they weren't taught to do this. Because I always wonder, how do you teach a dolphin to dance on its tail? No. They already know how to do that. They're just doing it for a fish, right?
Right.
And so it's like then, ever since then, my thought process is the body is infinitely, infinitely smarter than I'll ever be. Yeah. How can I ask the body, please, would you consider, I know you're a lot smarter than me, but could you maybe, you know, guide it towards a different possibility. And that different possibility in my small brain looks more like neutral. You know, maybe it isn't, but it looks more like neutral in my training of being a Pilates instructor. And what we do know is that if we can move towards neutral, is that's when the pain just drops like a rock. Yeah. And so we know we're taking some pressure away from the body and the body's systems. And so then we say, okay, we know that you don't want to hold this correction all day, every day, because it's way too much work. But can you glide into it 30 times a day, let it go, and then glide into it again, and then let it go, and just go about your day. So that's kind of where the thought process is. Take the body's infinite wisdom and ask for permission to do something that it already knows, but maybe on cue. And then the reward is we're trying to take pressure off of you. We're trying to ease your job. So we're trying to combine that.
No, I love that. One of the things that I've said often and say with scoliosis clients, other clients with asymmetries of whatever kind, is the body, this is what the body knows. The body doesn't know how to have a perfectly straight spine. It never has. Nothing has accommodated to that. And taking a body where it is and just seeing if you can allow it to find a position that is more efficient, effective, pain-free is exactly what I think what we always ideally do in our movement environments, right? And with scoliosis, it's just a little trickier. And you're trying to let that body, again, find how to find it itself. And that's what I really love about how you talk about this is you have that body needs to find a way to make those corrections within itself. It needs to figure out a way to like, how is this more comfortable? Is this more comfortable? Oh, that's the most comfortable. Let's play with that. Right. And it's, and you can guide it, but you're not going to tell it, do this.
You're absolutely right. Because sometimes the correction that the person in front of you needs is so, I was getting ready to say counterintuitive, but it's actually would be counter science, because the science says, oh, you should look at me with your eyes level. And I worked with a woman, I still see her all the time. But she came to me with excruciating pain. Like she calls it head banging pain, because she would wake up in the middle of the night with so much pain that the only way that she could not focus on the pain was to literally bang her head on the wall. And so she'd wake up in the middle of the night several times, banging her head on the wall to just, I don't know.
Change the pain signals or something.
Exactly. There, that's well said. Yeah. And so I asked her what she was trying to do for help. And she has a scoliosis fusion. She had it when she was a child. And that scoliosis fusion goes up so high and fused her spine in the curve, not because that's what the surgeon wanted to do, but because that was the only possibility that her spine was giving them. Okay. So the spine is fused in a side bend. So imagine being fused in a mermaid position and then trying to bring your head back all day, every day. And so she had excruciating pain. And so the solution for her was to stop trying to bring her head back up. Right. And so it seems so hard. Right. But that was one of the solutions is, okay, lie down. Let's see where your spine wants to go. And she immediately started bringing her head back. And I said, well, for a moment, let's just see if we can go in the direction of the curve, just keep that shape going. And I said, how's that? She goes, oh, that's fine. That's great. Okay.
Magic.
And so we started working in that direction. And so counterintuitive, counter science sometimes is what the body in front of you is showing, because like you said, Nora, it's not adapted to what's in the anatomy books. It's not created like that. And boy, if my humerus was shaped with a big letter C in the center of it, you would look at that humerus and go, oh, right, I get it. But because the spine and it's so many little bones, then our brains say, no, we should be able to restack those. This shouldn't be that big of a deal. But it is a huge deal. And a lot of it has to do with the shape of the bone and with the connective tissue neuropatterning. Yeah.
So you just mentioned connective tissue and neuropatterning. And that brings up just something I was thinking is, do you work primarily with younger people, with older people, with all ages in terms of your practice?
I do work with all ages. Currently in my practice right now, my youngest is 14, which is definitely not the youngest I've ever had. And my oldest currently is 91. So we work with them all. And we definitely get a lot of pain reduction and function changes at all ages. And that's been the gift of following this path. Yeah.
Yeah. Changing people's lives for the better.
It's well, they're changing their own lives.
That's right.
A tiny bit of information their way. Yeah. But
I say that all the time with clients, and they always want to put the success on us. And I have to remind them that my job is just pointing them in the right direction and kicking their butt.
Yeah.
It's it's their body that's going to make the changes or not. And hopefully the path that I've chosen for them does it as quickly as possible. But they're the one that has to do it. And thinking of that, I was wondering, I'm very big on homework. I'm very big on sending a client home with something, their first session with me. They go home with certain exercises that their body needs, you know, specific to them. They may be similar to someone else's, but specific to them and what they need. Do you believe in giving people homework to continue to do during the week? So much.
So we actually call it social cues. And so whenever I see someone the first time, I always tell them, I said, I really hope I get to see you again. But let's imagine that that life is going to happen. I'm never going to see you again. And this is what I'm going to send you home with. And I'll send them home first visit with something that they can do starting 10 times a day, building up to 30 times a day. And what that is it depends on the person. It could be as simple as just imagine, you know, there's space between the vertebrae, that all your vertebrae are hot air balloons and they're just going to wiggle themselves up to the sky. It might be that. It might be layered with 4 or 5 corrections. It just depends on the person. But they are told that they're going to do these corrections 10 times a day. And there's going to be something happening in their lives that's going to remind them. Every time you get water from the fridge, every time you brush your teeth, every time you're standing talking to a client or a patient, if you're walking the dog and the dog stops to smell a bush, which is like what, every 3 inches?
5 seconds, several times.
And so there's things that happen in your life. Maybe you push send on an email, so it's time to put your arms on the desk and elongate. But they'll get those social cue exercises on the first visit. And if we're fortunate enough to continue working together, then that social cue exercise will continue to develop and be more refined. And it's in that refinement where we get those like major aha moments where things start to make sense in the body. And when they're able to actually turn to me and say, no, the correction is here.
Yeah.
And we know we've gotten to the level where they're really tapped into what their body is telling them. Yeah, it's great.
Nice.
It's really great.
That's an interesting tell, because in my world, I do medical exercise and post-rehabilitation. And a client even today said, you know, today or this week was the first time, and I realized that I didn't have pain for a few days. And that sort of notice of, oh, it's been a couple of days, it's huge. It's a huge tell for me.
Yeah. Because
that's like, yes, you didn't have to think about it. It just happened. And then it was like, oh yeah, you know, that constant persistent pain. And I'm wondering if you see the same thing, whether those cues become more natural for the client and then they don't even think about them anymore, or whether their pain is reduced to a significant degree that they're like, oh yeah, I don't even really notice it as much anymore. Are there any specific ones that you're just like, oh, that just touches you inside so much, you're like, yes.
Yeah, so there's an exercise, like for example, that we call piano keys. And piano keys is a way of opening up the hollow part of the thoracic. There's one part of the thoracic that's our sticky outy side, and one side that's our hollow side. And the piano key exercise opens up the hollow. And so when I see someone lie down on the table and they go and they immediately switch themselves into piano keys, I'm like, my job is done. You can now be an instructor of Scolio-Pilates. But, you know, it actually happens quite quickly. And because there's a joke that goes around the scoliosis community that all I want for Christmas is both sides of my back to touch the chair at the same time. And so when they feel that for the first time, they're like, oh, this is amazing. And then also, Brian, there's certain things, we call them, obviously you probably have the same thing, but we call them keepers. Like when we do an exercise and it's like the light bulb goes on.
Oh yeah.
It's like, okay, that's your keeper. And so when they feel that thing at the occiput, or they feel that thing underneath the shoulder blade, or they feel that thing at the front of the hip or the SI joint. These are all really common spots for scoliosis. Then they know they just have to like prop those ribs up on an arm, open up that space, and move through it. Then they're already taking care of themselves. We try to aim for at least one of those to happen on the first visit, but it doesn't always happen. You know,
that's huge.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, exactly.
If you can get a keeper in your first, in one of the first, I mean, that's huge.
It's huge. Yeah, but I can't really take credit for that. I mean, the science behind scoliosis is important. You know, I say it's important also to move through it. And I think that's the next layer, but we can't move through it without the layers before. And so finding those nuances, it's very, very important. I tell my students who are taking like modules 1 and 2 for the first time, and they're very curious about, well, so is the goal to get back to the Pilates series of 5? And I was like, well,
maybe.
Yeah, maybe. It depends on the person, but it's like this. So imagine you have somebody without scoliosis, and they're going to come to you, and you're going to have them lie down on the mat, and you're going to say, okay, before you do this, before you do the ab prep and lift your head off the floor, what I'd really like you to do is drop your right ear to your right shoulder. Perfect. Now turn your nose to the left. You've got it. Now put your right rib on the floor and take your left rib off. Perfect. Now do a sit-up. Now you're ready to do the 100. You know, it's like, it's so if you can get them into a position where the abs are actually working harder than the neck, then then the Pilates 100 is a 5 could be a perfect.
Right. Love it.
Yeah, we often talk about there's not every exercise is for every client.
Yeah.
You know, and some clients, you know, fall in love with a certain exercise because they've been doing it for their whole life, but it may not be appropriate for them. And
Truly.
you know, and in this situation, there's probably a ton of them that for the client in front of you, it's like, yeah, no, not for you, not today. And maybe never, but we don't know. We're going to have to see how your body changes.
Yeah. So we try to divide exercise. I mean, you can divide exercise into a million different categories, but to just speak super broadly for a moment, we try to divide scoliosis exercise into 2 categories. And if this is the whole category, then there's a tiny little sliver over here, which is about a thread wide, which are your scoliosis specific exercises. That's your little thread. Yeah. If your body feels good, then the rest of the world is open to you. Go ride your bike, go do your Pilates series of 5, go swim 2 miles in the ocean. The world is open to you. And the stronger you are and the more fit you are and the happier you are, then your life is going to be better and your spine's going to be better for it. If you're in pain and you're struggling, then that one little thread, that one little sliver can make all the difference to the rest of it. And so if your client, if their whole exercise life is centered around Pilates, then go ahead and do the series of 5 as long as it doesn't hurt. And then return to that little sliver as often as necessary. And we do find that people automatically start incorporating all of the scoliosis corrections into their other exercise forms. Yeah.
I think when you said keeper, I think though for some clients, those are going to be the exercises they're probably going to do forever, just because it makes them feel good.
That's right. And when I say they have to do it 30 times a day, eventually they're doing it more than that. So I've probably done my own corrections talking to you 5 or 6 times in the last hour or so. And it just keeps things super happy.
Nice.
What I think I'm loving the most about this conversation and your approach is, yes, you have guidance. Yes, you have information. Yes, you have stuff to give them that's specific, and that you're trying to get them to understand their structure so that they can then make different choices about it. And then you give them the tools to make those different choices. Then they're reinforced by, oh, that feels better. And then you can keep working and doing, more and more, or going back to their daily activities, their sport activities, whatever it is. Like, I love the way that this starts from information and awareness and education. moves into experience, and then moves into really reinforcing that experience through exercise, through movement, through everything else they're doing. It's just that's the way we need to work with the body, and especially when a body is unusual or has things that are not served by keep everything symmetrical, keep both hips on the floor, and do a roll up or whatever it is, right? Like that's not going to work here. So how do you get that other piece in there? I love that.
How do I say that again? Was that a question?
I just said this, no, I just said you bring that other piece in. You really bring that empowerment in. I love it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm struck by that I try and bring to my studio, and I know Nora does with the clients she's worked with, is listening to the client in the body in front of you. Because that's the body that you have to help at that moment. And if you listen, if you're really clear on your intention and you're listening, then it'll talk to you and it'll guide you and it'll tell you where you need to go. And all of your background information, all of the stuff that you've learned will feed that and help guide you in that direction. But realistically, it's listening to that body in front of you, to the 14-year-old who can't do certain things, or the 75-year-old who just wants to be able to, sit in a chair without pain, to listen, respond, and be able to help those people. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's something that the Pilates work has really driven home for me, and some of the other things that I've studied. And when you work with these elite practitioners and you watch them work, they are profound listeners. And they are, yes, they have a big toolbox. There is no doubt about it. I wouldn't want to come up against that toolbox, but they are profound listeners. And like you said, Brian, it can be the words, it can be the movement that you're being shown.
Yeah.
But if you can slow down and just allow things to present, it's like the body's just waiting for someone to tell their story to.
Yes.
So, it's just really,
love that.
And it is a position of like, oh, wow. Are you sure you want to tell me?
It's a privilege.
Really humbling. It's really
very.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I mean, this last hour has just flown by, and hopefully everyone who's listening is like, oh, I want more, because it was fascinating. It was fascinating.
No, this is wonderful.
It's so fun to talk to you both. You both have so much experience and so much to share, and it's great to be able to hear your stories as well. So thank you so much.
And again, please tell us how people can find you. What's the easiest way? Any email if you want to share that, websites, please.
So the website is Scolio-Pilates.com, and it's Karena at Osteopilates.com. So yeah, that's where we can find us. Happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And anybody who has any other questions for Nora and I, please hit us up at movingcombos@gmail.com or hit us up on our socials. DM us, Moving Combos on Instagram, Moving Conversations on Facebook, or in the show notes, you can see Nora and my information. And so thank you very much, Karena. I really appreciate you coming on board and sharing all your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will see you guys next week.